And now to the challenge of manufacturing in Australia. In GDP terms, the sector shrank from a quarter of GDP in the 60s to just over a seventh in the mid-90s, and now it's under 10%. Professor Goran Roos is Honorary Professor at Warwick Business School in Britain and founder of think tank Intellectual Capital Services. He's been out here as Adelaide's thinker in residence, where our manufacturing future has been front of mind, and he joins me now. Goran Roos, welcome to the programme.
Thank you. Thank you to be here.
You talk about manufacturing sectors, manufacturing companies reaching maturity, going through cycles and then dying out. But over our protracted mining boom and no doubt an Australian dollar that's going to stay very, very strong, are we in danger of losing a critical mass in manufacturing in Australia?
The answer to that, short answer is yes. The issue that we face is that the Australian dollar and other operating environment issues has caused Australia to move from what was a low to medium cost environment to becoming a very high cost environment. You know, you passed the Australian cost level around 2008, 2009, and you are now roughly around 20% higher. And that creates a completely different competitive environment for firms. So firms that were viable in a low-cost environment because they were extremely efficient and they focused on imitation that was low risk, are now not as viable in an environment where you have to compete on high value for money in a high-cost environment that requires innovation rather than imitation.
So how do we make sure that we don't lose this critical mass? Because I know you're not a fan of subsidies for the auto industry. You'd be quite happy, I think, to lose the auto industry in Australia, and you don't believe this line about, again, critical mass attached to the car industry here.
Well, that is not quite correct. I am basically against subsidies as a matter of principles. Now, there are other things to take into account, and let me illustrate some of them. The automotive industry is an extremely tough industry to be in. It has a very professional supply chain, and that means that supply chain produces managers that are extremely competent. And that is very important given that many studies show, for example, a study by Roy Green at the University of Technology, Sydney, shows that the management capacity in Australian firms is second tier compared to, for example, the US or the European manufacturing belt, Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. And then you need to have well-educated managers, and that is one of the sources for those managers. So in my opinion, the automotive industry is an excellent source of management capacity that you have problems finding elsewhere. Now, you have to think very carefully around a long-term strategy for this automotive industry. I understand full well that it's impossible to accept a huge number of unemployed to let an industry die, but you do have to have a transition strategy to make this industry long-term viable. And if you can't find such an industry, then your money will have been wasted subsidizing this industry.
You say we've got skills and capability from that industry and indeed from defence, but so much of the success in the great Swedish multinationals, for example, seem to have been built on scientific invention. Now, you also say that research should be focused on business and not on academia. What do you mean by that?
I mean that we have two components that we sometimes confuse. One is research and the other one is innovation. And in very simplistic terms, research is the conversion of money into new knowledge, whereas innovation is the conversion of knowledge into money. And they don't happen automatically, and they are not individually linked on a detail level. They are overall. Australia spends an enormous amount of money on research, and you have fantastic scientific capabilities. You have very good research universities. But very little of that research seems to migrate into commercial activities in firms. So there seems to be a gap between the activity level and the spending on research and the benefit that you gain out of this in industrial activities. And your relative spending from firms on innovation activities is relatively low. And you're completely right in pointing out that the European manufacturing belt, illustrated by Sweden or Switzerland in this case, manages to combine good scientific activities with a high level of innovation, driven by a very large amount of investment in R&D in firms. And let me give me a numerical example. When you look at investment, for example, you tend to differentiate between investment in capital goods, so machines and equipment, versus investment in intangibles. And if you compare manufacturing firms in Sweden with Australia, their relative share of investment in machines is the same, whereas the Swedish firms invest twice as much in intangibles, which is R&D, design and business models. And that does make a big difference in productivity contribution.
Goran, you also talk about a lack of trust here that you've observed between government, companies, workers and universities. What do you make of our government at the moment, the Treasurer taking swipes at billionaire entrepreneurs and this confusion over company tax cuts and incentives at the moment?
Well, that is not for me to comment on. I am not fully understood about what those issues are. My view is, though, that if you stand in front of and facing a very large transformation, which actually manufacturing is in Australia, you cannot achieve such a transformation unless you have a common view and work together on these issues. You need to, I mean, productivity increases and changes happens in tough dialogues with common objectives between, for example, unions and management. Where I come from, we have an implicit contract that says that we both want extremely profitable companies and we want more of them. And once we have that, then we can sit down and fight over what to do with the profit. But we do share the common agreement on the first one.
Goran Roos, it's a fascinating topic. Thank you so much for joining us and keep thinking.
Thank you, Tiki.